I'm just going to say that we're thrilled that Mikhail organized this and that Joy Connolly is here. He's going to introduce her. I just want to let you know that on Monday, one of our the Herring Fellow in Art, Curatorial Studies, and Human Rights, Jean van Hiswick, is going to be speaking in the Courage to Be lecture series. And that's a reservation-only event, so if you want to come to that, please email Tina Stanton at Arendt@bard.edu to come. She's going to be speaking on on public art and creating public discourse and courage through public spaces and architecture. And Monday, May 4th, is a afternoon and evening symposium on H.J. Adler's work, and it's on translating the Holocaust. It's going to be a number of the translators of Adler's novels, as well as his book Theresienstadt, which is a classic of Holocaust literature that has never been translated for 60 or so years. And we'll have his son, who's been a huge activist in this project as well, here. And also Bill T. Jones, the choreographer and dancer, who has a new dance, Dora Transmontane, about the Holocaust, which will be shown through the Arendt Center on May 12th. We'll also be speaking on May 4th at the Translating the Holocaust event. So I hope you can attend that. It'll be from 4 o'clock on in Bard Hall. Now I'd just like to have Mikhail introduce tonight's lecture. Thank you all for coming.
Okay, thank you, Roger, and thank you very much for coming. I'm very excited that you're visiting Bard. I did my PhD at NYU, as most of you know, and I had the pleasure of teaching with Joy Connolly twice as her TA, and we had a lot of weekly meetings about both about the text and about liberal arts education. So I was really thinking of you from the beginning when I came to Bard, that there was a strong connection between what I did at NYU and the work that we do here at Bard. So I'm just going to read a little bit of your CV, not too much because people are probably read it already. So Joy Connolly is a professor of classics at NYU and also a dean for the humanities at the Faculty of Arts and Science at NYU. She received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and her books, her second book just came out. The first book appeared with Princeton University Press in 2007. It was called The State of Speech, Rhetoric and Political Thought in Ancient Rome. And her second book, which is probably what she'll be talking about tonight, is called The Life of Roman Republicanism, and that also appeared with Princeton University Press. So, very pleased that you're here.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for coming. I know it's an incredibly busy time of year, and I'm just pleased to be out of the city and here in Boston meeting you. And we had a really wonderful tour of the campus in the middle of the heaviest part of the rain, but it was still extremely beautiful.
Just for you.
Thank you. I know, it's like a gift, water from the heavens. So thanks, Mikhail, for inviting me, and thank you again for coming. So this talk is the book is like this. The talk is kind of like this, so you'll see its points of contact. It's in 3 parts. I'll talk a little bit about what's behind me, and I have a few more images for you to look at. And then in the second part, I'll talk about some texts. And that part of the talk actually turns to Hannah Arendt and her habits of reading and writing. And then the third part, which is mingled with the second, is about Roman habits of reading and writing. So this is designed for a plural audience. I think I said to Mikhail, there's something for everybody, I think, or at least I hope there is in this talk. So, in a 2002 essay in political theory called The Adequacy of the Canon, George Kateb surveyed our age. He looked at the 20th century and he saw nothing happy. Weapons of mass destruction, genocide, radical fundamentalism, a world made smaller by technology and by methods of transportation and communication no one had ever seen. before, and he asked us in that article, what help, what inspiration, what assistance can the pre-modern canon give us? And he concluded, and I quote, that the canon up to the 19th century does something to help us, but probably not enough. And I emphasize that probably, because he was clearly being provocative and opening the door to our engagement and our better answers. So today I want to describe my answer, my view of the help given us by canonical texts of the Roman tradition of Roman political thought. And I certainly won't try to survey or summarize the central ideas of Roman political thought. That would be an impossible task anyway. And what I'm trying to do, as you'll see by the end, is really redefine, we use the phrase Roman Republicanism. So don't expect me to talk about what might come to mind instantly when you think about Roman Republicanism as an idea. Rather, I want to talk about the ongoing life of these texts, the life, how we keep them alive, how they continue to exist. So a life sustained in the act of rereading the texts. And I see this as an act of distinctive ethical value, and that will come across in practically everything I say. So let me start with that maybe surprising redefinition of the phrase Roman Republicanism from yet another surprising place, and that's contemporary art. And that's the image behind me. And I'll actually give you another one now. Not image text, but images are coming, just a couple. So this text, I think the 21st century will hopefully be more guided by how questions. How am I a product? Or how am I related to these people here? And what is the ethics implied by this? These are the words of Tino Sehgal, an artist based in Berlin, recent winner of the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale, so a figure on the global art scene. He's sometimes described as a performance artist, but he rejects this label emphatically. He calls himself an artist. He doesn't want any further label than that. He creates what he calls constructed situations with teams of people he calls interpreters or players. Texts are events, and as the Latin root venire suggests, which is the word to come, venio, so texts are events. Events move. They move in space and time. And Sehgal brings the eventness and the movement of the text into the sphere of shared embodied experience in his work. The importance of conversation in his work alludes to one classical text that clearly animates Sehgal in general and his whole oeuvre, and that's the Socratic dialogue. So, to mount Sehgal's work called This Progress in the Guggenheim Museum in 2010, Frank Lloyd Wright's massive rotunda and interior ramps were totally emptied of their normal offerings of visual art. So after visitors bought their tickets and walked across the rotunda floor, most of them visibly baffled and saying, "Where's the art?" Sometimes with expletives. Where is the art? They would meet a child of about 7, 8, or 9 who, like Socrates, asked permission to ask them a question. What is progress, was the question. Though few of them knew it right then, this small person was their first interpreter in Sehgal's piece. So let me imagine, as I describe the piece, a lone female visitor. The encounters could happen in small groups, families as well as, but I'm just going to imagine a lone female visitor as I walk you through this walking piece. So, female visitor, if she agreed to answer the question, and about half the people asked said no, which actually really surprised Sehgal. The numbers of people saying yes were much higher in European museums where he'd mounted the piece before. So if the visitor agreed to answer the question, she would be ushered up the first ramp where the child listened to her answer to the question, what is progress? And the child drew her along a little way, introduced her to a waiting teenager, and repeated her answer as accurately as possible to the teenager. Once the child left after that repetition, the conversation would continue, this time really in overt Socratic style, with the teenager probing the definition, just like Socrates would say, what is courage? He'd get an answer, well, is that really courage? So the teenager would say, why do you think this is progress? Give me an example, et cetera, et cetera. After a few minutes of walking, they would then be interrupted by an interpreter aged between 25 and 50, and after the teenager handled those introductions and walked away, these two people strolled up the ramps for another 7 or 8 minutes of conversation. That was the longest sustained part of the piece. Near the top, that interpreter, the middle-aged interpreter, vanished through a trick of choreography using the big pillars in the Guggenheim, who disappeared from sight. And a person of between 60 or 70 years old stepped forward and told a short autobiographical story. That was the end of the piece. Well, across town at MoMA, at exactly the same time, At her retrospective, Marina Abramovich was provoking shock or silent reflection by compelling visitors to do a whole number of things. Walk close to naked performers, or most famously, as you can see here, stare at her in silence. Segal, by contrast, instructed his interpreters to coax their partners in the artwork to the most interesting place, conversationally speaking, that they could possibly reach. So, and remember, at any moment, there would be 15 or 20 children and as many teenagers and adults and older adults in dialogue with dozens of visitors. This progress, this piece, replaced the shuffle and stare that visitors do in museums every day with an interactive experience, triggering sensory perceptions that subverted the dominant aesthetic regime of the museum, where the temporarily immobile human eye gazes at permanently immobile artwork. And of course, discursively stabilized artwork as well as immobile physically. So in this piece, together with the interpreter, the visitor was the artwork, or made the artwork, and there's a lot of debate over that difference, or whether those words mean the same thing, what to be or to make. The power of the piece really rested in the blur between being and making that was experienced in the newly created human relations, the serial sense of we that the visitor and her interpreters created on their walks. So it might be obvious by now that, or maybe not, but I worked as an interpreter for this progress, and that's how I know the piece so well, and I start with it for a number of reasons. And first, like most of Segal's works, this progress is constituted in or made by visitors to the museum. So that means it's irreducibly plural and eternally new. There's a single artist, okay, but the artwork is not singular. Now, maybe your ontology of art holds that interpretation as part of an artwork's essence, and so if you think this, you might object. You could say this in any artwork or text. But in Segal's art, visitors are literally necessary for the piece to be. In the winter of 2010, when the lights went down and the doors were locked, the Guggenheim Rotunda held no art. And by the way, Segal doesn't permit his works to be recorded on film or on tape, although you can find bootleg versions briefly, sometimes on YouTube. But he seems to share Plato's ambivalent view of recorded text, which you can read about in the Phaedrus. So his artworks must become only memories. So what interests me here is not really the content of the art that this progress made or became, but the critical priorities that its mode of entry into the world brings to our attention. Classical studies has long rehearsed the debate between historicism, where the object of literary scholarship is to reconstruct the original meaning of a text, that is, to identify the conditions that limit what the text can mean, and the hermeneutic turn that seeks to read the text as it presents itself to us, meaning being realized in this view at the point of reception, as you all know. Both sides of this debate, though, treat the text, point A, and the reader, point B, as the normative objects of analysis and theory. Historicists seek meaning in questions like, where is the text located? What conditions shape its content and style? But hermeneuticists ask, where is the reader situated? How does he or she read the text? In contemporary literary discourse, these points have now become thoroughly naturalized. As the classicist Charles Martindale has complained or warned, he says they've become congealed as occluded metaphysical entities. So this progress, and I'm reaching my wind down to this introduction, this progress holds promise, I think, as a model for reading the canon, because we can't make sense of it by looking of this piece by looking to the interpreter, point A, or the visitor, point B, as discrete entities. Because the art exists in the conversation between visitor and interpreter, generated anew every time a visitor answers a child and starts the piece, it necessarily reorients our attention away from A and B to that which emerges between and beyond them. Segal was originally trained in dance, and he remains keenly attentive to bodily and sensory experiences. His encounters include formalist elements that heighten our attention to the way we take notice of and feel ourselves being in the world, in the presence of others, in company and conversation, literally, with others. In this progress, these elements took shape as rules that were an explicit part of the interpreter's training, introductions, repetitive questions, artful positioning of bodies, and other things. Like literary norms, like once upon a time, ... these rules stylize the interactions and signal to the visitor that the conversations were intended to be out of the ordinary, And they also provided a stable framework within which the participants could let themselves speak freely. And believe me, they did. They said amazing things and told private things about themselves you'd be shocked to hear. When this progress worked as intended, and it didn't always, which we might want to talk about later, walking and interacting with the hitherto totally unknown person on the ramps of the Guggenheim was a distinctively, passionately generative experience. The living sensation of creativity, that ideas were being birthed through conversation, rested on each agent's visual and physical awareness of each other. At the same time, the piece was not a private feedback loop. The rules and our walking motion and the sight of other walkers defamiliarized the encounter, tugging our attention to one another, forward and outward. So I see these aspects of this progress as a living expression of our readerly relation to texts, as things we think about and produce ideas from while thinking with. By this analogy, this progress prompts us to concentrate on the thinking that can emerge out of the reader's encounter with the text, the activity and the products of thinking not just about the text, but with and beyond the text in the world. What it suggests is not so much a literary hermeneutic or a theory of reception, as it does a living model of something I'll call purposive conservation, and I'll come back to that phrase a couple times. The felt presence of the other in this piece, this progress, also reminds us that thinking with is impossible to do in the absence of regard for the other. The presence of the other in that piece was sometimes frustrating, sometimes annoying, sometimes exciting, but always urgently there and impossible to ignore, and necessary, as I said before. But that is to say, in sum, through the sensory experiences the piece thematized, this progress allowed us to see and to feel that thinking is an ethical relation. So let me now turn to Hannah Arendt's reading of the classical canon as a way to dig deeper into this ethical relation and its embedment in the reading I'm calling purposive conservation, which I'll explain more clearly next. And I also, of course, will talk about the role of Roman texts in both these things, the ethics of reading and purposive conservation more specifically. So Hannah Arendt, I hardly need to say, probably to most of you, is most famous today for her readings of Greek thinkers, and especially Plato, and for her identification of the public space of the Athenian agora as the model for politics today. But Roman writers are at least as important as Greek ones in Arendt's work, especially in the Life of the Mind, on revolution, the essays in Between Past and Future, and her later introduction into politics, not to mention her work on Augustine. This is becoming better known, but I think from when I talked to Arendt scholars and thinkers, I think 25 years ago, it really wasn't particularly well known that she was as interested in the Romans as is becoming commonly known now. If Socrates furnishes for Arendt the model of a moral thinker who thinks with, then the Romans are Arendt's choice for public and political thinking with, where she saw Athenians like Pericles treating action as the object for future remembrance, a famous piece of her conclusions about Pericles in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, that Pericles' funeral oration is the object of future remembrance for future Athenians, for future Democrats, and that's really the point of Thucydides' text for her. She saw the Romans, by contrast, converting action into the basis of future action, not just memory, but acts. And in the Roman context, action for her emerges out of feeling and memory, the two are hard to disentangle. As a tragic thinker, Arendt's attraction to the Romans is heightened by her belief that they share with us apocalyptic awareness of supreme evil, the possibility of total war, and terror, which you can talk about why she thought the Greeks didn't have this experience, but she had a special sense of affinity between Romans and modern Europeans and Americans, and indeed citizens of the whole globe. The Romans, she said, felt, and I quote, the awful extremity of having been thrown into a world whose hostility is overwhelming, where fear is predominant, and from which man tries his utmost to escape. End quote. So Arendt sees Rome as the source of the Western notion of tradition, and indeed of the canon itself, coming into being at the moment when the Greek tradition had begun to unravel historically. But more specifically, she's inspired by the Roman habits of repetition and treaty making, reading and rereading, and that's really what I'm going to talk about. Thanks to their conquests and their choice to maintain an empire, and before the consolidation of autocracy by the end of the 1st century CE, the Romans had to turn their attention to the importance of reaching agreement about the future, of making and keeping promises, and of the dire consequences that follow up on the failure to forgive or the breaking of a pledge. These are all Arendt highlight words, but also highlighted words, highlighted issues in Roman literature of the Republic. The empire's foundation out of the experience of defeat memorialized in the Aeneid compelled them to incorporate the consequences of war, and specifically the fate of the conquered, into their political acts. In the cycle of war and treaty making that makes up Roman history, which, given the violence of war, as the first and last lines of the Aeneid suggest, this all must make room for chance. Whoops, excuse me. Looks like this. There we go. A lot of order here. Sorry about that. So in the cycle of war and treaty making that makes up Roman history, which, given the violence of war, as the first and last lines of the Aeneid suggest, must make room for chance, Arendt argues that new possibilities for politics arise. Novelty is thus built in to the formation of tradition from its birth. And this is precisely how the Romans read and write, how they make culture. Arendt herself returns repeatedly not to history, but to Virgil's Aeneid as a repetition of Homer's Iliad, and Virgil's framing of Rome as a new Troy, founded in a treaty arrangement with the Italians, and then later, historically, Carthaginians, Greeks, and Gauls. And she returns repeatedly to Cicero's engagement with Greek thought, especially his iconic phrase about judgment and feeling in the first book of the Tusculan Disputations, when Cicero says, "I prefer, by Hercules, to go astray with Plato than to know truths with those others," i.e., Plato's opponents. Roman writers, in Arendt's view, anticipate Arendt's own approach to the canon. In the act of repetitious reading, new ways of thinking and acting arise that are embedded in the web of human relationships, to use one of her phrases. Or to put it another way, Arendt's readings of Cicero and Virgil not only enact in microcosm her own approach to past texts, they imitate Romans reading past texts. So her act of repetitious reading embeds her in tradition, in history, and yet crucially empowers her to move freely on the wave of new thinking, precisely as she sees acts of repetitious reading of Roman texts before her by 18th century revolutionaries, by Machiavelli, by Augustine, and it goes on and on. And these are acts originally established as culture, culture itself in Republican Rome. So this is the beginning of my redefinition of what you should think of when you see the phrase Roman Republicanism, really the invention of culture as we understand it in the Western tradition. Let me just take one look at this text, which is hanging behind me, which I haven't seen anything about yet. So this is you see the famous phrase, the Mene Aedathea, Pelea Deo Achilleus, sing goddess, or wrath, sing goddess of Peleus' son Achilles, usually translated sing goddess, the wrath of Peleus' son Achilles. And then in Virgil's Aeneid, you're thinking about the Homer and oral tradition set down in writing somewhere around 800. Virgil's writing right around the year 0 roughly. And he's taking these two words, arma virumque, arms and the man I sing, and referring, and this is like a little bit of Classics 101, but referring in those first two words to the arms sung about in the Iliad and the man referring to Odysseus, the topic of Homer's second epic, as the Romans viewed it. So pulling together in those first two phrases in an act of creative reading and compression, a reference to the entire Greek tradition, starting with Homer, that comes before Virgil. So it's this constant engagement and awareness of the other and of the past that Arendt zeroes in on in her claims about the Roman formation of culture and its political implications. One of Arendt's deepest engagement with Roman texts occurs in her treatment of the American founders in her book on revolution. She starts by quoting Rousseau. She says, "The great problem in politics, which I compare to the problem of squaring a circle in geometry, is how to find a form of government which puts the law above man." The American solution to Rousseau's challenge, Arendt argues, is Jefferson's appeal to a transcendent source of authority for the laws in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," famous phrase to all of us. Since the Constitution itself, Arendt points out, is silent on the question of absolute authority for the law, Jefferson's sentence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," with its confidence in the power of human reason to recognize certain truths as such, locates the legitimacy of the government in the action of thinking, "we hold." Well, on what grounds could the founders adopt a claim for legitimacy that evaded appeals to God or a new supreme being? For Arendt, what made this possible for the founders were, and I quote, "the examples of Roman antiquity that constituted their sensus communis, their common sense, their common political imagination." Their turn to the Roman Republic, she claims, was not just romantic or conservative, although it was also that, nor was it just a product of a love of tradition for its own sake. It was pragmatic. She says they recognized they needed models and precedents for their own experiences. They're in conversation with the past and making that conversation produce something new. Arendt's narratives of the Republican Active Foundation, the Roman and the American Active Foundation, remembrance, reenactment, and difference, novelty, reenacted over time, not only by the American founders, but by many other founders of republics, may be seen again as an analogy for Arendt's model of reading, her model of purposive conservation. Her argument reads the founders through Cicero and Virgil, and she reads Cicero and Virgil through the founders. So when she says that the Roman concept of authority, let's see if I can find this text. Yeah, there we go. When she says that the Roman concept of authority, and I'm reading the quotation, suggests that the active foundation inevitably develops its own stability and permanence, and authority becomes a kind of necessary augmentation by virtue of which all innovations and changes remain tied back to the foundation, which at the same time they augment and increase. Okay, she's talking about the invention of a state here, the foundation of a state, but it's as though she's describing her own and the founders' own and Cicero and Virgil and other Romans' own act of reading. This notion of a coincidence of foundation and preservation by virtue of augmentation, that the revolutionary act of beginning something entirely new and conservative care, which will shield this new beginning through the centuries, are interconnected, she says. And she concludes this was deeply rooted in the Roman spirit and could be read from almost every page of Roman history. Now, the American project of citation and imitation that Arendt is talking about, when she looks at the American founders, was operating within the constraints of time and economic and technological change. When the founders acknowledged that the new nation was no longer a matter of founding Rome anew, but of founding a new Rome, a novus ordo seclorum, as you can read in all our dollar bills and coins, she says they had to admit that the thread of continuity that bound Western politics, modern politics, back to the foundation of Rome had been broken. Yet, she says, when reading Virgil's fourth eclogue, as she imagines the founders doing it, possibly romantically, but I think not actually from our evidence of 18th century American education. So she's saying when reading Virgil's fourth eclogue, the founders might have been faintly aware that there exists a solution for the perplexities of beginning, for the challenges of beginning a new state. So let's look at that. This is the last sticky quotation of our we'll look at here. What saves the act of beginning a state or beginning a reading, as I'm comparing the two, what saves the act of beginning from its own arbitrariness is that it carries its own principle within itself. Or to be more precise, that beginning and principle, principium and principle, are not only related to each other but are coeval. The absolute from which the beginning is to derive its own validity and which must save it, as it were, from its inherent arbitrariness, is the principle which, together with it, makes its appearance in the world. The way the beginner starts, whatever he intends to do, lays down the law of action for those who have joined him in order to partake in the enterprise and to bring about its accomplishment. With this difficult passage, we venture into very deep and interesting waters. And I'll give you a second just to look at it again, and I'd like you to think about it, not just in view of what Arendt is claiming about founding the American state in the 18th century, which is what she's talking about here, but also to reread it, keeping in mind my opening description of this artwork, of this progress, and think about how the two together. I'm going to read the last sentence one more time. The way the beginner starts whatever he intends to do, lays down the law of action for those who have joined him, in order to partake in the enterprise and to bring about its accomplishment. So what is the way the beginner starts in the context of Roman history? Well, part of Arendt's answer here is, as I've just said, a reading of the fourth eclogue, which she takes, along with every other classicist in the world, as thematizing and celebrating newness itself. It's a poem about a new Messiah figure who's going to come and save the Roman world, save the Roman Empire. She comes to call this, of course, natality, the human capacity of bringing new things into the world. But Arendt also has in mind the constancy of the Roman awareness of their relations to others, the relations of Senate and people, themselves and the people they conquered, and especially their relations to the people whose culture they made their own, and yet not fully their own, starting back in the 3rd century BCE as the Republic became an empire, and that's the Greeks. So how do these beginnings start? What is the way the beginner starts? The beginning of a treaty, the relationship of state to state, but even more importantly for Arendt, I think, in thinking about these issues, the relation of culture to culture. The Princeton classicist Dennis Feeney gives us a very provocative picture of the Romans' inventive and mimetic capacities and proclivities. He says, no society in the ancient world, other than the Romans, systematically took over the prototypical forms of the institution of Greek literature and culture as the basis for a corresponding institution in their own vernacular. It's basically saying no other society in the ancient world copies like the Romans do, and copy so wholly and so perfectly with such an intense energy. Feeney speaks of a new determination to get it right in transposing from the model culture in the Latin works of the 230s, 240s BCE onwards and through the end of the Roman world as such. And to quote him one more time, as he's actually using the work of Michael Tausig, the relationship is always oscillating on both sides between concentrating on otherness by focusing on what's similar about their rivals and concentrating on similarity by the imitative process which best enables them to define and master what makes up that otherness. Well, I'm not interested here so much in the historical picture of the bilingual or trilingual writers in Latin, like Ennius, an early epic writer who influenced Virgil, or writers in Greek who are Romans, like Fabius Pictor and Cincius Alimentus. If you're not a classicist, you won't know who these people are, probably. They're fascinating, but I'm not really interested in the historical experience of them as bilingual or trilingual writers. I'm not interested either in the socio-cultural questions that emerge from this literary historical fact. The Roman self-policing of their acts of imitation, their cultivated habits of selective memory. What I'm interested in thinking about Roman literature and its orientation, or Roman culture and its orientation towards Greece, in the context of Arendt's reading of Cicero and Virgil and the ongoing conversations with later readers of the Romans, and keeping in mind, too, the image of Segal's constructed conversations, is how the act of writing Latin literature for Roman Republicans may be understood as an act of engagement with a canon of another, a Greek canon, a Greek culture, that is also an ethical act. For Romans like Cicero and Lucretius, Catullus, Horace, and Virgil, all canonical Roman writers, the task of writing Latin may be described as responding to otherness, rendering that otherness legible and apprehensible, refashioning the existing norms by which we understand the category of self and other, and in that inaugural refashioning, finding a way of responding to singular otherness. I'll just put up the iconic example once more of Virgil's engagement and transformation with Homer. The point is that the task for Roman Republican authors is always one of relating between the Roman writer, the writer in Latin, and that which is heterogeneous to him and yet legible, and yet somehow his own property, somehow in an essentially fundamental relation to him. To read creatively in this way, as Roman Republican authors do, is, as the literary critic Derek Attridge puts it, to work against the mind's tendency to assimilate the other to the same. It's attending to that which can barely be heard, registering what's unique about the shaping of language, thought, and feeling in the work. It involves a suspension of habits, a willingness to rethink in order to apprehend. So for the writer of literary Latin, in an entire tradition formed around relating to another, the experience of alterity runs broad and deep. In its staging of the literary, of the basic processes whereby language works upon us in the world, the Latin literary work is always what Attridge calls a reading in the sense of a performance, a putting into action or putting into play that involves both active engagement and a letting go, a hospitable embrace of the other. The Latin work becomes its author, its other, that's a good pun, and yet not. So the Latin work becomes its other and yet not. To respond to the demand of the Latin work as the demand of the other is a challenge. And I'll quote Attridge one more time. He says, poignantly, and I think in a way that's capturing the modality of Virgil rewriting Homer, Attridge says, "Understand how little you understand me, translate my untranslatability, learn me by heart, and thus learn the otherness that inhabits the heart." I think thinking of that phrase as an account of Virgil's relation to Homer is an essential, it really gets at the heart of the ethical awareness that I'm claiming colors these Roman Republican texts. Well, as everyone in this room probably knows, Arendt saw thinking with as the sine qua non of thinking itself. Her calls for the self to consciously position itself vis-a-vis another person or text or historical event appear throughout her work to underscore her conviction that sharing the world with others is necessary for both individual moral judgment and the kind of thinking in common she found crucial for politics. In her account of Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem, Arendt argued that Eichmann was capable of committing crimes and seeing them as defensible because he'd lost the habit of thinking. By saying that Eichmann could not think and naming the source of his evil thoughtlessness, Arendt meant that he was utterly unable or unwilling to see his actions from the perspective of another because he no longer held, if he ever did, the internal dialogue with the self that tests what one can bear living with. So he'd lost the capacity to judge himself and even to understand why others sought to judge him. Arendt developed her thinking about good and evil from, as again I'm sure you know, from Kant's critique of judgment, which identified the three fundamental principles for aesthetic judgment. One, to think for oneself. Two, to think in the position of everyone else. And three, always to think in accord with oneself. Kant's object is to understand the purposive use of the cognitive faculty. And the key move in his argument that attracted and held Arendt's attention and outline is the second principle, which ties the self's cognitive processes in the judgment of taste to the judgments of others. Arendt returned repeatedly through the 60s, through her life really, to the mark of Kant's broad-minded man, his capacity to set himself apart from the subjective conditions of judgment most men are locked into, and reflect, as she says, from a universal standpoint, which he can only determine by putting himself into the standpoint of others. Kant's enlarged way of thinking involves imagined dialogue with others and in constant awareness with the other. The self must then cultivate regard for and curiosity about others' potential views. Arendt saw this cultivation as a process of the imagination. She cited Augustine's Confessions to support her account of the self as an entity that imagines within, yet imagines things are from without. So I was lying when I said we had no more quotes, because we do have this one, the chunky one left. She argued that, and you can see it behind me, imagination alone enables us to see things in their proper perspective, to put that which is too close at a certain distance so that we can see and understand it without bias and prejudice, to bridge abysses of a remoteness until we can see and understand everything that's too far away from us as though it were our own affair. This distancing of some things and bridging the abyss to others is part of the dialogue of understanding, for whose purposes direct experience establishes too close a contact, and mere knowledge erects artificial barriers. Arendt took imagination to be key to the formation of the sensus communis, the common sense that allows one to feel oneself to be a member of a community with others at the same lived time, and crucially, especially for me, with others across time. Arendt's attempts to transform Kant's aesthetics into a theory of moral and political judgment is very well known by now in 2015. But what's not often noted, and what I'm really trying to bring to your attention today, is the way Arendt's thinking about thinking, and her practice of reading, and her interpretation of Roman Republican culture are mutually interdependent. In her hands, Kant's principles of aesthetic judgment are transformed into a reading practice that has a purpose, and whose purpose is to create the new, and whose other purpose is to conserve the past. And this is the root of my phrase, purposive conservation. Arendt thinks by thinking in the position of another, a practice she identifies as starting with Socrates. And I hope we can see now, or at least begin to glimpse, how this thinking with, as the foundational act of politics and culture, is a tradition whose start she locates in Rome, and particularly in Cicero and Virgil. And I can say more about that specificity if you want. For Arendt, there is, though, a temporal specificity to Roman texts, especially the texts of Cicero and Virgil, that sharpens the pretty abstract ideas I've been working with so far. Her essays, The Crisis in Culture and On Revolution, suggest that the Roman canon's self-conscious embodiment, or embedment rather, in the past legitimates it distinctively as a dialogical partner in generating new thinking in the present. What leads her to Roman texts is precisely the temporal double bind they inhabit in their cultivation, or cultus, of the past, their creation of culture. This is how they orient themselves toward both past and future. But there's nothing automatic about this. And this is why Arendt is always asking of Roman literature and directing us to ask not only what, who, when, or why, but Segal's question, how? How are we related to these texts here? How have others conducted their relations to them? A quest that must be asked, because we wouldn't be reading these texts today were it not for the tradition constructed by past readers, the conversation past readers have had with these past texts. And what is the ethics implied by this? The passage of time, or more specifically the temporality of canons, the formation of the canon in the course of passing time, matters enormously to Arendt. She writes with acute self-consciousness of her existence in a state of being in between a past that is no more and a future that is not yet. Now, one can object that her conservation of the classical past is driven by romanticism, by desire, by nostalgia, or just bad history. People have said all these things, and there's an element of truth to all of it. One could say she uses Hellenism or Latinitas as a provocation, or just that she over-aestheticizes. But Arendt doesn't engage in dialogue with Plato, Virgil, Cicero, and the rest by sheer chance or just because she thinks they're useful. New thinking, she believes, is crucial for us to continue living in a world whose material and technological conditions are constantly in flux. But how can we anchor new thinking in the world, and thus make it responsive and responsible to the world? She answers in her essay on civil disobedience, no civilization, the man-made artifact to house successfully generations, would have ever been possible without a framework of stability to provide the wherein for the flux of change. These are the rules of the canon, by which the canon are formed. And these rules, the pillars of the canon, in her view, bridge the space between people and between time periods. When they topple, the world as we know it becomes more vulnerable to decay and destruction. Through citation, quotation, and argument that connects readers to past texts and their past readers, Arendt anchors the world of the present in the worlds of the past, resisting tendencies of forgetfulness and rejecting wild effort to extinguish history in the name of reform or novelty for its own sake. Her didactic appeals to tradition transcend time without forgetting time. And I really have lied about the chunk of text because there is in fact one more. Making sure you're, but this is really it. There is, she said, really. There really is. There is, she says, a small track of non-time, which the activity of thought beats within the time-space of mortal men, and into which the trains of thought, of remembrance and anticipation save whatever they touch from the ruin of historical and biographical time. This small non-time space in the very heart of time, unlike the world and the culture into which we are born, can only be indicated, but, and I've italicized, I hope, here, this phrase, it cannot be inherited and handed down from the past. Each new generation, indeed every new human being, as he inserts himself between an infinite past and an infinite future, must discover and ploddingly pave it anew. And here I think she's thinking about reading Latin and Greek in the philological tradition, and that's why she uses this word ploddingly, which if you're a classicist and you spend a lot of time with the dictionary and grammar, you understand in the very bones of your being. And I think that is crucial to that, her choice of the word there, ploddingly. This is an existentialist re-envisioning of the word tradition that actually goes against the grain of its Latin etymology, trado, to drag down. She's talking about pushing back, pulling back. Once we emerge out of the non-time space created in our thinking about ancient texts, in Arendt's view, readers have a duty, note she says, must, to choose texts that will allow them to hand down a tradition to later readers, should they choose to engage in the relation themselves in the future. Her thinking is driven by her desire to understand and guard against the horrors of the 20th century. We choose our canon not only for ourselves, but for the future. That's her thought. We may draw on core texts, we may also draw on marginal texts, but what matters is the paving, which cannot hold if it has no purchase in the present. This is more than conservative nostalgia or highbrow elitism, although there are elements of both, again, in Arendt's thinking. This is a defense of culture, remember something invented by Republican Romans, that makes culture public, just exactly as Republican Roman thinkers and writers would have claimed was central to the concept itself. Just as the subject needs local particulars to anchor herself in the world of others, so the new thought needs memory and feeling. Otherwise, however captivating, it risks becoming rather a purely private affair. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with private thinking, but it comes at a price. The new idea will lose some of its integrative capacity, its ability to tie others into the ongoing cycle of reading and thinking. And this ability to tie others in is what Arendt finally finds so distinctive about Roman texts. In the secular act of religare, the word that behind religio, to bind back, she locates nothing less than Rome's contribution to human existence. Like this progress, Arendt's style of reading presents her argument as emerging out of and impossible without a conversation with another, in the presence of the memory, remember, of past conversations. She hears and writes as her own the voice of Cicero or Virgil, not that she can become one with them, but she can't imagine herself, to use another famous phrase of hers, in their place where she is not. To engage in thinking with of this type is to recognize one's dependence on the other and to explore the potentialities and the weaknesses of that dependence. The political theorist Tracy Strong sees an ethics at work in this process, and so do I, but I'm going to quote his sentence. He says, "To hear as one's own the voice of the other is not to be one with the other, but to recognize one's constant temptation to deny that relation, that is, to exclude the other as other. But my existence as other depends on others," he says, and this in turn requires the acknowledgement that no one's soul or self or body is his or her own. Well, we've long understood the Roman Republic, as I started out by saying at the very beginning, or hinting at this anyway, that as the Republic is the embodiment of tyranny of different types. Imperial aggression on the one hand, oligarchic oppression on the other. Imperial aggression abroad, oligarchic oppression back at home. Well, today I've sought to bring to your attention other elements of Roman cultural and political practice: imitation, memory, the cultivation of an awareness of self and other that are baked into the heart and the core of Roman literary practice, which animate Hannah Arendt's style of reading and thinking, and which I think answer Kateb's provocative question about the value of the pre-modern canon, not as a static body of ideas that exist out there for us to define and argue about, but rather a relation to cultivate us with the text. This is, I know, a very unusual way to think about republicanism, but I welcome your questions and discussion about it. Tina Segal and Hannah Arendt are two figures who read and transform classical texts, although they work outside the borders of academia and classical scholarship. And both of them adopt unfamiliar, uncanonical practices of reading that renew Greek and Roman literature, its tropes and figures, even as traditional possibilities for engaging with Greek and Roman literature are slipping away or have slipped away for good at this point in time. So I would say whether we adopt their paths or pave our own, to use Arendt's word, pave we must, and with attention to the world we inhabit now. Thank you.
Oh,
So pen at the ready for your questions or comments.
I'd like to begin.
Happy to, or Tomas?
Been invited to some philological questions.
And historical ones too, yeah.
No.
Good, yeah.
I have one historical one as well. I've basically three questions. One is very limited, and that's whether Ploddingly is there any Roman echo in Ploddingly, since you highlighted it as.
I was really thinking about the act of reading as she sees it. I mean, responsible reading with attention to the tradition requires labor, and I think that's what that the maintenance of a sense of alterity in the face of the other, is what she has in mind, and that does involve the work of learning a vocabulary and learning a grammar. So that's really what I had in mind. It doesn't have a Roman resonance, certainly not linguistically. Not etymologically.
Yeah, thank you. My second question would refer to two of the quotes that you provided. One was the one from Understanding in Politics, and one I think was the one with augmentation was from On Revolution, right?
Yeah, I can flip that.
I mean, talking about referring to tradition, referring to the past in a way of connecting and distancing. It just occurred to me that two words in those two quotes are marked with inverted commas. One is augmentation and the other one is distancing in the other quote.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about why those two words. And then they also come up not marked in the same passage.
Yeah.
And also the distancing, the same with distancing. And I was wondering whether you had any thoughts. What that is doing.
Yeah, with this one, she's underlining here the root of the word, as you might have guessed, you may know, augmentation. So she's connecting up growth and the idea of increase and addition with the word auctoritas, the word for authority, which is the possession, along with dignitas, kind of dignity, social status, of the Roman ruling oligarchy with the senatorial order. And her claim, and this is, here's where you could ask a whole bunch of historical questions, or historically oriented questions about her way of reading, which conveniently sidesteps a lot of, it's just not interested in the historical reality of the Senate and its dominating relationship with the people. Although I think it's not a tyrannical domination, and there's a dynamism there myself. But what she's trying to see in the senatorial order's claims for a sense of authority, in the sense that their determinations for the res publica are going to be the right ones and need to be the policy of the state, and that's what auctoritas essentially is. She was saying, well, the fact that it's auctoritas depends on this word, augeskere, which is why it's in quotations, because she's drawing attention to the etymology. It's about addition. It's not just about going back and repeating and appealing to the past. It's about adding on and opening up the space for the new. So that's why she has put the inverted commas around that word. The other quotation, let's see if I can find it here. Yeah. So this one, I'm sure because this is so common for her to do, she is also thinking about the etymological meaning of the word, so standing apart from in a relationship, in a relationship of self and other. I think in the context of this quote, she's also thinking about distancing in a skeptical way. She's underlining it, she sometimes does, and other people in the room may know more about this than I do, the limits of physical and embodied language when she's talking about ideas and thought. I think that's what's going on here. And she's not always satisfied, as I think many of us, probably all of us aren't, with the metaphors we use to describe our relationships to thinking. And I think that's one of the reasons that's highlighted here.
Okay, and and the last question is, how do you read the gesture of referring to Roman Republicanism in the way you suggested it in the American political and intellectual public in the 1960s, where those quotes are coming from? Well, 50s and 60s. What is that doing?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I can answer, actually, because I'm not... when I think about what the word republic would have meant in the 50s and 60s, I might have to call for assistance in defining that here, because I think when I think about my own intellectual history in the context of American academia, republicanism, was really not on stage until the 70s, really. It gets going with the revival of interest in Republican political thought. I think the work of people like John Pocock. So work that really comes out in the 70s. It's kind of getting going in the 70s and 80s. So in the American intellectual political theorist scene, it's really liberalism all the time, right? And so the notion of republicanism and republics, really, the word republic, I think, stands for a certain kind of conservative patriotism, and not a whole lot more than that, is my sense. So it's also a word she uses interchangeably, interestingly, with res publica, as though there's no difference. And this is another one of the limits of, or the pitfalls of Arendtian purposive conservation, as I'm calling it, that words get bent to your own purposes to such an extent that they lose exactly that alterity of another historical time and another language. But that's another wrinkle to your question about what the word republic would have meant in her work.
Yeah. I'm not sure. There's a lot of valences of republic. It comes out of a lot of her work on the worldliness of things, the res publica. But within the context of On Revolution, she's really fighting against democracy. Right. And she, in many ways, is one of the origins of republicanism in the modern phase. Because
I should have said that first.
She's fighting against the revolution, the Jacksonian revolution in America, and then the Wilsonian and Roosevelt revolution that have, in her mind, corrupted the American Republican tradition. So a lot of these works are from before that period, some of the 50s, before she's writing On Revolution, but some of them are later. I think authority is, the other quote on authority was from On Revolution, so that's that period. And when does she write What is Authority? Do you know?
It's in between past and future, right? Yeah.
The early versions are in the early 50s.
Yeah.
That early.
But
It doesn't surprise me.
A lot of that is coming from Machiavelli as well. So the valences of republicanism goes to the public. But I don't know if that's... I don't know. This was fascinating, and
I wanna, in a friendly way, challenge your putting together Arendt and this progress by Tino Sehgal. And so, first of all, I think it's convincing and really rich and interesting to sort of put together Arendt's reading of Rome and her thoughts about authority and foundation with the practice of reading. I think that's great, and I very much liked it. I mean, her stuff on what's his name, Hermann Broch, would be fascinating. I don't know if you've, I mean, her essays on Broch and trying to work through that. I've never been able to really seriously work through it, but I think it's a fascinating part of what she's trying to do.
Who wrote The Death of Virgil?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if that's a book you know.
It's an amazing book, yeah. No classicists cannot read it.
Right, and she calls that the greatest novel of the modern era, right?
Yeah.
And it's because, and I think it's because it's an attempt to, what? Well, she calls it that. I mean, I don't think you get dissent from that. And so, one of the key reasons she likes the Broch book, The Death of Virgil and Toward Virgils, and one of the reasons she reads this way is, as you rightly said, that you have to engage with the alterity of the other, you have to bring the past, you have to live in the world you're in and the world that's been created, but also created anew. There is a problem in a world in which that tradition and that bridge has been lost, which is the world I think she thinks we're living in, and yet she, to a certain extent, struggles against that, and to a certain extent accepts it and tries to reconcile herself to it. Okay.
And it's a tragic history.
And there's a tragic history.
Tragic arc.
But if there's one move that she, at least as I understand her, and here's my attempt to be somewhat, here's a question that she really does find problematic. It's the practice of adapting work, or in a sense, writing work that doesn't require an attention to the original. So in Crisis of Culture, as you know, because you cite from it, she says that the real danger is when people make movies of Hamlet, or translate Hamlet in easily accessible prose, and we lose the connect, and what that does is it creates new text, and we don't actually go back to Hamlet, right? And so, the great danger is you make a new Hamlet, no one reads Hamlet anymore, and we lose the connection of the past. So you offer this progress by Sehgal as, in a sense, a rewriting of Socratic dialogue,
Right.
Which has no worldliness. It doesn't connect to Plato. Many of the people engaging in it may or may not have any read Plato, have any knowledge of Plato, may not know it goes back to Plato. They talk to someone, they go home, they say, I had an experience. It's exactly the kind of worldless, memoryless, thoughtless, in an Arendtian view, kind of art that she would say abandons our culture and our tradition and makes it not longer necessary to read Plato, but to have experiences of something new. And so it strikes me that art like Sehgal's is really dangerous from an Arendtian point of view. Now, I put that out there, and from your very reading, it seems that you would want to be very critical of art like Sehgal's, at least as I understood it, because it cuts the tradition in a way that makes art accessible and easy. Whereas she thinks you should go learn Greek, right?
Yeah.
And that to not learn Greek, or at least not to struggle to read Greek with Greek inflection, because you're taught by a great classicist, is to ignore the world out of which we come. So I just...
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So I think there are three reasons why, just to begin with, three reasons why why the criticism doesn't hold, in my view. I'll see if I can convince you, or others. The first is that Sehgal chooses always mounts this piece in a museum building, And the structure of the museum is really crucially important to him. Now, he does make works for private commission, so it's not that he doesn't do private art to be mounted in private households. But the vast majority of his work and interests is not only for public spaces, but museums and galleries specifically. So for him, the physical surround of a piece has to connect to the traditional form of the museum. So there's a sense in which the physical space is a part of and embodies the tradition that his art is very much setting itself up against, in the sense that it's not visual, he does a lot of recordings, that kind of thing. He doesn't call himself a performance artist, etc. The second is the presence of the rules that make the piece work. And in that sense, I mean, this isn't about tradition, I know. So this is more coming at it in a kind of phenomenological way, that the awareness of, like, people were very aware of their manners in the piece. So now that you could then say, well, you could have another conversation about Arendt's whiteness and elitism, and that opens up a different line of thinking. But there are ways in which we were introduced to each other and greeted each other by name that preserved the habits of an older age. So there was an evocation of the past in that sense. The third is really the ways in which the interpreters talked about the piece as a Socratic dialogue and injected in their own conversation, at least in that mounting of the piece. There's, it's not like that all the time, but injected into their mounting of the piece the awareness that they were part of this Socratic tradition. So that sense of ethical responsibility, the sense of reenacting, although Tino Sehgal doesn't like to think of his pieces as reenacting anything, and would never, and certainly would resist a definition of the piece that presented it as, a play of a Socratic dialogue. But that awareness was really baked into the interpreters. I guess I can think of a fourth thing, and then, but I have to think about this more clearly, and that's the question itself, which, what is progress, which started the piece. It did get described in a lot of reviews as a Socratic style of question. So there was an injection of that in the popular discourse around the piece. But fundamentally, I guess it's whether the hardest part of your question really is the rootlessness. I mean, you said it was a worldlessness piece. And I'm trying to articulate why I'm reacting so, that seems so wrong as the way you describe it. And in part I go back to my description of the beginning, the ways in which it was all about being with another person, and in that sense, but not about the world in the sense of history and tradition.
Yeah, I mean, it's worldly in a worldless sense, right? It's worldly in a sense of a world disconnected from tradition. I mean, to me, the defense of it is that it's like someone, and this is the defense many modern artists make of this critique, is I'm just presenting the worldlessness of our world. I'm just presenting.
Oh no, that wasn't it. I mean, the question of the piece that began and ended the piece from the experience of the participant was, what is progress? So it was all about the passage of time. I mean, the theme of the conversation was itself change over time. I can't say every conversation involved discussion of history or tradition. That's true, but that framing of the initial question is really important. So that's why what you just said doesn't hold at all. It was not about the piece was not about the worldlessness of the world that we live in.
I'm not sure.
Because of the question, what is progress? It always elicited answers about, change over time and the lived experience of the world and change.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I might actually think that would lead to a question of the break of tradition, but depending on how people respond. But I mean, I don't want to monopolize it.
This is really
we
good.
we can go on over a while.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I thank you very much for this very illuminating presentation. And I was struck by one passage, and I kept thinking about that. When the connection between principium, that's a beginning, also political beginning, and a cultural beginning, and a principle that, of course, they're interrelated and they cannot be one without each other. And I was thinking about Benjamin's critique of violence, and I was thinking also that his idea of revolutionary violence, and also the violence that established the law. And in the context of a Roman conquest, even there was no new beginning without a military conquest. And I was wondering where violence, where you see violence within the framework that you just outlined.
Yeah, in the context of my model of reading, that's a good question to answer, a good question to think about, because is there the potential for violence in the act of reading? I mean, I think no. I mean, one could say yes in a metaphorical sense that there's, but I'm very wary of talking about violence in the metaphorical sense, especially since you've just raised the historical reality of Roman conquest, and in fact, the literary text that I chose to put up there was, the beginning line of the Iliad, the beginning line of the Aeneid, and the last line of the Aeneid, which are all about, violence, the violence of war, and the death of, the death at the end of the Aeneid when the hero kills his Italian opponent in the first establishment of Roman Imperium, which is the act of violence that literally founds, and the vocabulary word, kind of classicists, love this little factoid, but when Aeneas buries his sword in his opponent's chest, the word is condere, which is the word, like our word condominium. It means to found, to build. So it's a there's just no getting around it. I mean, the act of killing and the act of founding the empire, it's exactly the same. So with that in mind, that's why I'm sheering away from claiming that there's a one-to-one, that there's a violence that I could talk about metaphorically in the act of reading. I don't think there is. So that's how it's a good question. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Actually, can I just follow up on one thing that
Yeah.
made me think about? It occurs to me, though, as you were talking, that the Romans certainly imagined that there's a violence to their reading of Roman texts and culture. It just makes me think again about Horace's Graecia Capita, captured Greece. That's such a violent image.
In the act of writing, you mean in the act of the writer reappropriating? Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, a good way to take that question. The act of, I guess. So classicists are very comfortable, I think, with the idea of thinking about Roman Imperium and its aggressive conquests, and exactly the image that Horace wants to, he wants us to do that. He wants us to think of the Roman writer as appropriating, but also being appropriated, by being stolen away, carried out of himself by the power of this seductive, maybe kind of effeminizing and yet an effeminate culture, Greek culture. And at the same time stealing it, making it rather his own. And I think what's gotten, so this is why I'm, kind of bracketing or distancing the notion of violence from or the fact of violence from the acts of reading and writing, that the kinds of, this kind of Levinasian language that I was using, I mean, that awareness of the other, that seems to be, to me, to be the core of a Roman's engagement with the Greek text, has been so thoroughly overtaken by the metaphors of violence in classical scholarship that we've forgotten about really other sides of it. So it's become either, it's either the violence of imperialist aggression, or it's competition, another great metaphor that, or it's anxiety, the anxiety of influence in the Bloomsian. How can I kill the father, and as I take over the father's writings. So kind of ironically, the violence has totally colored the ways in which classical scholars read Roman engagements with Greek texts, or Roman accounts of their engagements. They're rewriting in the sense of Greek texts. And so what I'm trying to do in thinking of this purposive conservation is, as a Roman way of writing and reading, as well as Arendt's and our potential way of writing and reading, is to recapture or challenge us to think together about whether we can recapture an ethical practice there that is about awareness of violence done. I think one of the things that really makes Roman appropriation of Greek literature so powerful is precisely that it's done in the awareness of conquest. And it would be different if it were Persia, very far away and never come. And I think one of the things that's driving Dennis Feeney, whom I quoted in this paper, his new book on Roman appropriation of Greece, is precisely this question of what does it mean to have, to remember the violence done and yet recuperate, revive, change, transform, and care for, have regard for. So, but yeah, thanks, thank you. Yeah.
I would, if I could continue with the passage questions,
Yeah.
I'm totally fascinated by the fact that Cicero and Virgil become sort of Arendt's canon, especially in the context of your talk, because it suddenly occurred to me that the Aeneid, which you seem to be so engaged with, is actually one of the first non-Republican texts we have in the Roman tradition.
It's not non-Republican.
Well, but sort of,
Someone else's
yeah.
question.
No, but I mean, anyway.
No, go ahead.
But I'm sort of interested in those choices and sort of what you see behind them, and what that sort of means about how she's sort of reading this engagement.
Yeah, when I first started reading, when I read Arendt's On Revolution, sometime in graduate school, I remember thinking, she's treating Roman texts like they're all the same, like they're all coming out of this mush of, that we can call Rome, and doesn't even really, she talks about empire, republic, res publica, imperium. She doesn't really talk at all about autocracy, so she doesn't use that word, but that's because she's not really interested in questions of monarchical power so much. But when it suits her, she'll kind of import backwards in time. But anyway, what I've come to, so two things have happened in my thinking about this, and one is I've come to terms and tried to think constructively about the way Arendt reads, choosing not to pay attention to certain historicist questions that have been so dominant, certainly in classical scholarship for the last, since forever, basically, since the early modern period. But also, I myself have changed pretty radically in my thinking about when the Republic comes to an end. So, so this is a classicist cocktail party question. When does the Roman Republic fall? When does it change? And people will take stances on this. I mean, there are two ways we can think about it. We can either think about the Republic really radically changing into something other than what it had been in the 130s BCE, when you get the emergence of intense spurts of political violence, factionalism, the likes of which the city hadn't seen before, and the emergence of enormous armies in the same generation that gave individual aristocrats powers that they'd never had before. So you could go the kind of radical early question and then say everything that happened up there from the 130s to roughly the year 0 when the Emperor Augustus, we shouldn't say emperor, but we do, is the first autocrat to consolidate kind of dynastic family power, comes into power. Or you can go the other route, and this is the route I actually follow, which is to say, let's think about a world in which the possibility of a senatorial SPQR, the Senate Populusque Romanus, as the dominant regime in Rome. When's the last moment at which that seems to become impossible to think about? And that's not till 69. So it's the first, towards getting into the end of the 1st century CE. If we think of 31 BCE, Augustus kind of wins the last civil war. This is almost 100 years later. That's a lot of time in antiquity, short generations. People don't live that long. It's a lot of memory passing. But it's the first time in all our historical sources, the year 69, that the ruling dynast dies, or military dictator, I'm trying not to use the word emperor, that person dies and no one suggests bringing SPQR back. That everyone just is looking for who's going to be the next autocrat. So by that read, since Virgil is writing, well before that, we can think of him as a Republican author. And so this is where my thinking has evolved, that it makes much more sense to me, I think, in understanding the evolution of intellectual, political history, cultural, literary history, if we think of Republican concerns as really dominating through the middle of the 1st century CE. So this, for non-classicists, who cares? But this is a debate that I think really helps gives us more to think about and think with as we think about the working out of Republican quote unquote questions through the middle of the 1st century CE. They're all there, they're still being asked. So.
Does this mean, sorry, just to follow up, I'm really fascinated with, does this mean that sort of Arendt is reading, or sort of your reading of Arendt is that she's sort of reading different boundaries of the Republic than were probably read in sort of her education about Rome?
I think she was. I mean, I think
Yeah.
she certainly she read Virgil as a Republican author, and she doesn't deny that there's a central hero in Virgil's Aeneid who it clearly alludes to, I mean, very obviously alludes to this dominant figure, Augustus. She also knew very well that autocrats had emerged earlier in Roman history, that he wasn't the first. And I think she grasped really the heart of the Aeneid's question, which is or set of questions, which are really much more about tradition, memory, and violence than they are about one-man rule. So, yeah.
I have a question on Arendt and a question on Rome. The question on Arendt is that given, provided all that you said, of course, she does have a criticism of Romans as opposed to Greeks at some point. And this is in the human condition when she opposes the spirit of legislation, the politics of creating laws, which of course she associates with the current parliamentary regimes. And the Greek democracy, where supposedly they didn't do that, or well, they created as few laws as possible. So this legislation comes from the Romans, and this is poiesis. This is this kind of productive power in politics. So with your example, it would be literature would be already poiesis and would be bad, while this performance that you told us about would precisely be practiced and would be the right thing to do. Although I agree that actually on Revolution she actually kind of revises this and moves to the Romans.
Yeah, that's a good question. So here I think about the historical worldview. I mean, really what we were just talking about. When the Romans start creating digests of laws, that happens really late. It's definitely 3rd, 4th century. It's an imperial, autocratic, monarchical apparatus. The kinds of laws that the SPQR Republic passed resembled both in procedure and in impact much more the laws of the Athenian Agora than Arendt really cared to acknowledge. So when she's talking about leges and the formation of digests, she really does have in mind something centuries past. Even the late definition of even if you push the Republic, to the year 69 in my somewhat fanciful but deeply serious claim. I mean, the year, I don't want to go on record as saying it has to be that year, but you get the point, right? The digest and the formation of those laws is literally centuries later. But that's something for me more to think about. As for I'll just say that, actually.
Yeah, and I have another question on Rome, just out of curiosity, because I read in Paul Vane that actually Roman imperialism was very egocentric. He says it's very archaic in nature. It's like basically you have your village and everything around your village is just outside world. And you occupy this outside world. So in his view, they didn't have much respect for the other with a big O, but yes, they saw some others, they colonized them, and then probably the assimilation had the same logic. Well, it's there, we take it. It's there, we take it. No respect. I don't know if this fits with your description or not. Maybe it does.
Well, I think that's an accurate description. I think the origins of Roman expansion. I mean, one thing though really distinguishes Roman expansion, military expansion, from other forms of Mediterranean expansion. And so Vane's on one side of this debate, but there's a debate about it in Roman history. But the thing that distinguishes Romans as they grow is that they enroll every town they conquer. They enroll a certain number of its citizens. They make them not full Roman citizens, but they give them a civic status. This isn't something that other Mediterranean city-states did. They tended to make treaties or arrangements with those peoples. It isn't until the Romans really start making treaties with subject nations that have their own long-standing kings or local aristocracies that the Romans changed that original kind of enrolling as citizens model. Even then, though, when they make treaties with other nations, they enroll usually a slice of the local oligarchy as Roman citizens. So there's a holding at a distance, no question about it, because full Roman citizenship is not given to every resident of the empire again until very late, around the formation of the laws we were talking about a minute ago, actually a little before that. But it is, it's a patchwork, really, of a combination of demanding tribute and exerting military domination over these areas, and also embedding slices of the population in the workings of the Roman state. So it's I think Vane's, accurate description of the early stages of Roman imperialism doesn't really capture this complexity of what emerges pretty early on in Roman Republican history. This dual treatment of subject cities and nations. And also, I would again just say, in thinking about how the Romans physically materially exploited the regions that they conquered, and then their own understanding of what they were doing culturally, it's different discourses, but thanks. Questions?
I was just wondering if you could say something about why this is an ethical project for you and not a political one. Well, if you see that as being in tension with the centrality of politics for Arendt.
Yeah, that's so to take the first part. I am trying to think of in this project something specific about reading and how we read and why we should read the text of the past, which is why I began with the K-TED, like what's the use of reading it? So thanks. In thinking about reading, then I'm very skeptical, I guess, of claiming collective civic political experience. I think that connection is awfully hard to draw. So my focus was really on reading. So in terms of Arendt's, the stuff or content of Arendt's political thought, or in fact the political content of the texts themselves that I also have in mind, I'm in a sense, at least in this, really thinking about the underlying life of the text as opposed to the life of the text, in terms of what's in the text. I do think, though, and so I'll just say one more thing about in Arendt's claims about the imagination and the potential political power of the imagination, that there's, one could say, a lot more about then the content of, about the Roman texts and what they are about. They often are about either war or about political relations, civic relations, there's more to say. I would have involved me talking for another 2 hours if I tried to say it all. But there's, I think, much more to say. I'll just give one example about the Roman concern with not just being aware of the other in especially the Greek other in Roman writing, but the importance of summoning up a shared image. It's one of the effects of the enormous impact that the rhetorical tradition has on Roman writing. So that, you think about a poet who's trying not just to tell a story, or an epic poet who's giving you a narrative, but trying to summon up the very images, so that all the readers are sharing the same images of Roman history or particular events. Those kinds of that's how I think about potential. That's the starting point for a civic or political reading of these texts in an Arendtian mode. I think the shared imagination, the shared communist senses. Anyway, the book that I published last fall does, I think, answer your question, because there really was trying to think about doing close readings of Horace and the historian Sallust and Cicero. I was trying to think about what this Arendtian ethics of reading and engagement with the past, or how that plays out in an actual text. So this is kind of a big plug to just get the book out of the library. I wouldn't say buy it.
Arendtian ethics, it's really interesting.
Yeah. Thanks.
Shall we just end on this note?
Ah.
I'm going to take one more question. It seems perfect. So thank you very much for
Yeah.
your talk.